Hector, let's talk a little bit about programmatic media, right? We still hear so many clients think they're using programmatic media and they're really not. And what I mean by that is they're relying on a third party to buy it for them, but the third party isn't really benefiting the client because they just keep the change, right? So they just spread their margins, so to speak. So can you tell us, what are your thoughts on programmatic media and what should clients be looking for in their partners?
Wow, great question. It's kind of a loaded question, I guess, too, because there's so many components to this, right? Programmatic was revolutionary when it first came out. That's the ability to advertise at scale, the ability to put your hands on keyboard and plug in what you want and send it out, and on multiple publishers, on all of this this scale that was not so accessible before. I think what has happened is so let's talk about programmatic for a second, like how that actually works, right? So this is tapping into different networks, and there are different data sources, and there are different DSPs, and these ways of getting these ads from the advertiser onto the publisher. And those ad networks, those DSP, what a company is using, if you're relying on another company to do this for you, there's a lack of transparency there. There is a lack of, there's a lot that can be a set it and forget it, which does not function well.
Right.
It's like paid search. You can't just set this and forget it, or you're going to end up wasting a lot of money. And that's the way it is with these as well. They're not as, there's a need to be dialed in with who you're reaching, how you're reaching them, what those ads look like. There's so many different components to how you execute this that I think requires a level of understanding, first of all, on the part of the person, the entity you're using to place these ads for you, and then on yours as well to hold them accountable.
Right. Is there technology that we can tap into that can help maintain that accountability? When you, as an advertiser, have an agreement with someone to say, okay, you're going to place this media buy for me, right? You're going to execute this campaign for me. Ideally, what the client wants to do is track it, right? So you're looking at third-party tracking that is ultimately functioning either as the ad server itself or as the verification partner.
Gotcha.
That helps you to say, what am I buying? What am I getting? Is this good inventory, right? That ultimately helps to validate your buy. And I think that using and ensuring that you're using that technology is highly recommended, because what you don't want to have is you think you're buying X while you're actually receiving Y, right? And I think that's the biggest issue that still plagues the industry. I mean, that unfortunately, I think it's part because a lot of the advertisers either don't really understand it, or they just don't have the time to really say, or the resources to say, here's someone that's going to be dedicated just ensuring that this is happening, right? We're still functioning, obviously, from a trust basis, which is great, but that validation helps to ensure that trust remains, right? And it's a long-standing relationship.
Right. No, so that brings up a really good point. And on that subject, yes, this is where I've spent a lot of time, which is on the side of the tracking and the results and how this was, what are you getting, and this is where there are, again, multiple data sources. Google Analytics was, the one that probably everyone uses. Some people use Adobe Analytics and some other ones, but I mean, that's typically the number one place you go. It's like, okay, what did I get back? Right. What ad brought them here? What did they do when they got here? Did this convert? All these different components. But there's actually a lot more that you can collect from that, about that information, if you know. Right. And that's something that we like to help with, is to say, let's now tap in directly to what's occurring, and then provide a report that tells you, what was, your return on your ad spend? What was your, what happened? What happened? You spent all this money, you made this investment, but what did you get for that? And that really does come into the reporting, the tracking, and having that all set up properly from the beginning. It also is necessary on the setup side. So when you're setting up a campaign, making sure that you have the tracking parameters included on the click-through for the ad. Like, there's so many different components that are required to execute this from start to finish that a lot of times get neglected. And I've seen tons of these where somebody does not put UTM tracking on a click-through. And so you have no idea like how they got here, or they do it incorrectly. There's a misspelling, and now it's just looped into an entirely different category. And things like that, where there are a lot of pieces, but making sure those pieces are in place so that you can accurately track the success of a campaign are essential.
Yeah. Now, you brought up Google Analytics. So let's talk Google Analytics a little bit.
Let's do that.
So, Google Analytics has been in existence for a long time, and it's something that a lot of marketers have gotten used to seeing and utilizing and trusting. It becomes kind of this single source of truth, whether it is or not. It's a whole other topic.
Correct.
Now, obviously, GA3, which is what we've been used to for a long time, is gone. Now we're using Google Analytics 4. So what's the biggest change that has happened from GA3 to GA4?
It's a great question. GA3, also known as Universal Analytics, was the standard for so long, and people were used to going on there and seeing the bounce rate and the session duration and things like that. This was a very session-based way of looking at traffic, page views, things like that. What GA4 sought to do, ostensibly, right, if we want to take them at their word, what sought to do is to look at this more as an event-based tracking. So instead of tracking people based on their session or that they were a specific user, again, they were sort of prepping laying the groundwork for this cookieless world. And part of that is saying, okay, when somebody comes to your website, now we're going to track everything as an event. So a page view, a session is still an event that occurs on a website. And there's some good things about that. There are some valuable insights you can draw from GA4 that you couldn't from GA3 or Universal Analytics. That said, there was a lot that was left out. I mean, this is still in beta. They're still changing things on GA4, navigation, data collected, et cetera. I mean, when it first launched, they weren't calculating bounce rate. They weren't calculating session duration. These weren't even available metrics. You had to sort of figure those out, which was right away frustrating for the average user, the average company that wants to just know how this is working. We're missing all of these pieces. And now they were left with other metrics that they didn't quite understand, engagement rate and engagement time and things that they weren't, familiar with, that you'd have to sort of take the inverse of to figure out what a bounce rate was, things along those lines. And so that's been a challenge, because now you're having a whole new, glossary of terms you have to learn. Number one. Number two, GA4 now is doing its very best to not have you identify things down to a specific user. And so there's this break between user-derived metrics, session-derived metrics, things like that, where they're not going to tell you down to the individual visitor what happened. If you try to dial it in that much, it will not let you have that report, which is a very big difference than what happened in the past. We were talking with someone about, being able to see, was it men, was it women, what age groups, all of those things were available, readily available. And even though Google did, not give you that much information if you had very few users, you could figure it out. Now that information is almost impossible. And you can see this because the moment you apply a user-derived metric on a report, the numbers drop significantly, because what Google's trying to have you do is group, is just look at the group. And, again, because we create these personas in what we do look at cohorts and clusters and groups. That's okay. But the reliance on Google Analytics to give you dialed in information, it's not there. So there's a need to collect information separately, to process that information separately, and to report on it in a different format than what you see in Google Analytics. And it's just how this has evolved.
And Hector, but is Google still collecting that data though at the user level?
So that I think is the most frustrating part, or the where you throw your hands up, because Google's still collecting every bit of that information, still collecting IP addresses down to the IP address. They're not giving that to you. They're still collecting every bit of that. So in GA4, in that reporting, you can't access that information. So there's a need to find it elsewhere.
Do you think though that at some point in the future, GA4 will have that information? I mean, obviously it's been collected and it's there, but we're just not getting access to it. So do you think that'll change?
I do. I think it's going to change probably first for paid users. And I think that's where that's going.
Interesting.
Again, all that information is there. For example, not to get too into the weeds, but in the past in Google Analytics, you could track an event that happened on your site, and you would create a category, buttons, and the action would be a click. And you could do this. You could do this category, this action, and then you could label it like, oh, it's on this page, or it's this text, or whatever. These 3 parameters. Well, what GA4 has done is given you an almost unlimited number of parameters. There is a limit, but you can create 30 parameters around a single click that tell you all sorts of things about it. Try to find that in a report, though. You can't. It's not in the report. Can't access it. So it's collecting all this information. But unless you manually enter this information, and even only some of that information, you can't see it. Which is crazy. It's crazy. But that tells me that they have plans for this.
And I hadn't thought about that, the paid version, This is something that you inspired a new thought here, because obviously for a long, long time, Google has been trying to diversify its revenue, revenue sources. Right now, everything that is developed or brought by Google is paid for by SEM advertisers, Search is their number one. They've tried to diversify in a wide variety of ways. I think data is definitely going to be a plan, based on the fact that with a cookieless world, they'll be able to control maybe identifiers, or they'll be able to really understand or set the standard, when it comes to the exact identifiers we want to use. In the future, we might refer to this as the Google ID, or whatever the case may be. But I hadn't thought of GA4 as a revenue source, which makes a lot of sense. I mean, you have so many users utilizing GA3, and it's always been free. It's been the free source, So, and we love free, Everybody loves free.
Exactly.
So,
and then the more you use it, and the more you rely on it, and then now you almost can't live without it, right? And so they had to do this shift to GA4. But if I'm looking at where I think things are going, I think that's going to end up being in levels. Oh, you can still have it for free, but if you want to unlock this, then it's at this tier and that tier. I think that's coming. I think these walled gardens, which Google is one, are going. I mean, they're going to be very proud of their inventory and their availability. I think when you talk about identifiers, we're talking about these groupings, and how that's sort of where things are headed. Well, exactly what Google's going to do is they're going to sell groups, right? You want to reach this group? We have this group available, This is where this is all going to go for sure. In my mind, I see that happening, and they've had a paid version of Google Analytics for enterprise level, Nobody was going to pay for that on the average company, The typical brick and mortar is not going to spend this exorbitant amount of money. So yeah, I see that coming where there's going to be tiers,
right?
And if you want access to this information, you're going to start having to pay for it.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Brilliant from their end,
right?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, no, agreed. Google's going to be just fine. Yeah, they're going to be just fine.
yeah. That's fascinating, right? As we try to make predictions of what will happen and whatnot. I do think that. From an advertising perspective and brand's perspective, a heavier reliance on those walled environments, and Google being a key player on that, right? Not just on search. They're really trying to grow outside of search, right? That is their primary source of revenue. But if they can get into more of the, not necessarily the ad tech, right? But the data, and the insights in terms of the analytics, that I see that as their revenue targets.
I would completely agree. And I think, again, you have other sources like Meta that are going to be very proud now of their inventory, and now they have so much more value for their data. They've always had value in their data. That's what's made them a valuable company. But now they can be much prouder of that,
right?
Because you are reliant on it. Yeah. And it works, and it's going to work.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about inventory pricing, right? So for a long time, digital campaigns kind of, boasted the fact that we can do a lot more for less, right? Versus traditional media, right? TV or radio or anything like that. That is obviously changing, right? A key driving force behind that were DTC brands, right? And obviously COVID-19, when that happened, there's just a massive increase on DTC and direct to, for those that don't know, direct to consumer brands. And so everyone was trying to sell something online. And what we've seen happen is cost per acquisitions have tripled.
Right.
CPMs have tripled. Right. And most clients don't always necessarily understand that. What do you think is, a good way to approach with clients or with advertisers the rise in pricing?
It's a good question. it's interesting because having been involved in paid search, especially for so long, and you see the cost per click, of like one keyword, you could buy for $1, now it might cost $75, depending on what entity you are. There's going to be some level of which there's more competition for this. And that, to your point, with COVID-19, especially when the pandemic and a lot of people going towards more digital advertising, where that competition for the same eyeballs increase significantly. Right. But we're several years past that now.
Right.
And now we're undergoing this new shift, with the cookieless world, some we talked about, where I think, again, this inventory is going to continue to rise in cost. I think the solution or the angle to take or to consider is about the value of that inventory and getting the most value out of that inventory. So this is exactly why you can't spray and pray, why you can't just blast ads out there, because it's not going to be cost effective anymore. In the past, you could get away with that. Right. You'd get enough back where it was fine.
Right.
Now you need to be more strategic in your approach. And I think that's the takeaway.
Yeah.
You just need to be really strategic in how you approach your programmatic advertising, your social media advertising, all of it. Just be more strategic in that. And the way you do that is something else we talked about, which is, again, taking first party data, creating these sets of people that are going to be the right fit, and then targeting them more specifically than you ever did in the past.
Right.
Which is interesting because in the cookieless world, you're supposed to be losing that specificity as far as targeting an individual.
Right.
And while you might not be able to say, I want this exact human being, you can find a ton of people that look just like that one exact human being.
Right.
And I think that's a benefit.
Right.
Because now you're going to be able to reach more of those people, when in the past you'd have to do a lot to reach that many people.
Right.
So I think that's the takeaway, is just understanding that there's a need for better specificity in how you target.
Yeah.
And just making the most of the dollars you spend, getting the most value out of those ad impressions.
Yeah. Excellent. So another question that I kind of wanted to think about is, media planning, right? Media planning is very specific. Obviously, when you look at marketing or a brand in general, right? Media planning is just one piece of the many different things you have to do. When it comes to media planning, what are some of the things that you would recommend in regards to the future, right? So obviously, in the past we've talked about cookieless world, price increases on our CPMs. Different walled environments and gardens that are existing. So how do you approach media planning to make sure that the client gets the best possible plan?
It's a really good question. And this is something that we encountered recently, reviewing somebody's previous media plan and seeing that it just missed the mark. It missed the mark because it was relying on sort of the tried and true and things we'd done in the past and didn't have that specificity that we're talking about.
Right.
And, to the extent that there was a lot of dollars, for example, being spent on Facebook, but analyzing their actual social media, well, first we analyze we develop these personas and we're able to see who their actual target. And this is where it really comes in, right? Understanding your audience. I mean, this is since the dawn of advertising has always been, that's been it, right? But now the ability to do that and to do it well and to really understand who we're targeting. Well, once I saw these personas and I saw that old media plan, I thought, you missed the mark.
Right.
And so no wonder you didn't hit your numbers last year because you put some ads out there, probably great ads, but to the wrong people.
Right.
And so analyzing it, found out that, Facebook's decent and Instagram was better, but TikTok, they were killing it, right?
Right.
I mean, and they weren't even advertising $1 on TikTok. Right. And so this is where this is where you need expertise.
Right.
You need somebody who's going to, first of all, evaluate, who you should be targeting. And that's where it has to start, is getting that data, understanding who should we be targeting. It all starts there.
Yeah.
And then based on who those people are, then matching the sources, the tactics, where they spend their time.
Right.
For example, another one is they were spending a lot on broadcast TV, but the majority of their personas are streaming.
Right.
No dollars were going to streaming. So you start putting those dollars towards a streaming audience, matching that persona, those locations, all of those things, you're going to get better results. And I think that's the part to me that I'm passionate about, as you probably could tell, but also excited about, because like when you can activate those correct channels with, obviously some curated messaging for those audiences, you're going to get results.
Right.
Like it should be the logical conclusion, right? The media plan you put together should be a logical conclusion of the data you collected, processed, understood, now who you're trying to reach. And if it's not that, and you're just taking a shot in the dark, you're going to waste money and a lot of it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Excellent. Kind of changing the topic slightly, you mentioned TikTok. And so let's talk a little bit about social media, right? So historically speaking, the social media giants has been Facebook, right? And for a long time, now Facebook grew organically, right? And just a couple years ago, we saw for the first time ever Facebook advertising, right? That is a big shift. It helps to indicate, the fact that Facebook is now the main social media platform, and it has main users, but it's also losing users, right? It's at a different phase than it's ever been. And historically speaking, Facebook for a long time, if there was a new player in the space, right, they would just buy it.
Instagram.
Right. Instagram, Snapchat, right? They would just buy it. And so that would allow them to do two things, right? Help kind of inflate their value as part of their shares. And the other element is it would keep control, right? Because they are still the driving force, right?
Yeah, and I would add to that, or I guess part of that, remaining relevant.
Yeah, absolutely. So now with TikTok, and TikTok obviously not being an American company, having not the ability to buy them out, right? Now they have a real threat. for the first time, really, their strategy no longer works in terms of just buying a thread out, right? They could just do that in the past, and it's worked really well for them. But now they have a new thread. And when you look at Facebook's numbers, just Facebook, not necessarily Instagram, but Facebook's numbers from a worldwide usage, you see that in some places, some countries, it's still growing. There's a little bit of growth, there's stability, but in other countries, they are starting to lose, right? And what's happening ultimately is, there's a lot of implications on age and the type of individual that is spending time on these platforms, right? So Facebook is now becoming, in the words of social media, geriatric, right? It's becoming the older.
Right.
Yeah, and obviously now there's a heavier reliance on Instagram.
Right.
But Instagram lost a ton of eyeballs during the pandemic to TikTok.
Right.
It went from being the main driving force of millennials and Gen X to now losing a lot of them, right, to TikTok. And TikTok went from being the trendy Gen Z and app to now millennials and Gen X spending a ton of time on that platform.
Yeah,
how do you think, or what would, if you were in Facebook's leadership, what would you do to try to combat this threat?
Well, that'd be great. I'd be fabulously wealthy. But I think, it's interesting because I was talking to my nephew over the holidays, and, just out of curiosity, I was like, what shows do you watch? He just looked at me with a blank look. Shows? None. Like none. No TV shows, no Netflix shows, no shows. Like most of his time is being spent on these short form video platforms, right? And this is why Google's jumped in with, YouTube has its shorts, and it's a vertical, instead of the old horizontal, it's now that short form. Instagram, same thing. It was Reels, now it's Stories, but have the same sort of, realized, okay, they couldn't buy TikTok, so they just emulated them, right? Like let's involve this. And there's been some success with those. I think for Facebook, this is the challenge, right? It's that not only is it this Gen Z that's starting to consume media this way,
right?
A lot of people are starting to consume media this way. The millennials are.
Right.
The Gen Xers are.
Right.
Because
Boomers even.
Exactly. Right. And so just like boomers adopted Facebook, right? It was a college kid app, and then it just, or website, and then it just slowly grew. And these other platforms are going to be doing the same thing. I would say Snapchat's probably an exception. It kind of still tends to be, because it's so ephemeral, they have a good selling point with what they do. Right. I think from a Facebook standpoint, their best bet is development. Right. It's changing, and they have done a decent job of it. If you think about how we, used Facebook in, 2008. Right. You're like, I ate a sandwich today, and you post that on Facebook. Right. Like nobody cares. Right. It's just not, that's what you chose to tell the world. Right. And it was really just about sharing. Right. And now it's turned into so much more. Right. And that's, I think, partially driven by Facebook, and then a lot driven by the users. Right. They wanted something different. They made that happen. Right. I think that there's a lot to say about that. So yes, it's, you can't just buy companies out anymore. Right. You do have to pay attention to how people are using media now. Right. Streaming is another good example of that. People they want to be able to see on demand what they want to watch. Right. Some people are willing to wait for an entire season to be over of a show, so they can binge watch it. Right. It's just a very different world, and it's really about keeping up with that. Yeah. I think when I look at it from an advertiser standpoint or marketing standpoint, it's the same thing. Like you need to identify, first of all, know who you're, I can't say it enough. You have to know your audience. Right. You just have to. But once you do, then it's how can we reach them the most effectively? Right. And if you know that, okay, my audience, they like short form video. Right. That banner ad's not going to cut it. Right. And so this is where you need to up your content, what you produce. Yeah. Work with a partner, or, if you can do that in-house, that's even better. It has a better feel. But it is about that. It's about understanding where are these people spending their time and how can I reach them more effectively. And I think that, it's the angle I always look at.
Right. It's interesting because as I look to what Facebook and Meta now is doing, I think their strategy is not necessarily perhaps correct, right? So one of the strategies they've done or have implemented is look to regulation, right? Immediately going to government institutions to say, hey, TikTok is a threat,
right?
And I'm the good guy here, and they're the bad guy. And so that I don't think is going to work, or if it is, it's obviously not working, right? Because ultimately the end user is still wanting to use TikTok. Yeah. And even if there was a countrywide ban, VPNs would easily resolve that, right? So the user is going to want it. The other tactic that TikTok has implemented that is just absolutely crushing it, and I wonder about the feasibility of it in a long term, is the Creator Fund.
Right.
People don't really understand this. You talk to parents and grandparents, and they say, "I don't understand why my kids are on why these kids are on TikTok so much." That's because they're getting paid.
Right.
They can make money on TikTok because TikTok has reserved over $1 billion in a creators fund to pay creators, right? So all of a sudden, this is now cash available for anyone who's creative.
Anybody with a smartphone.
Anyone with a smartphone, and anyone that wants to do it, right? So this is why the rise of influencers and people spending so much time and effort doing content on TikTok specifically, right? Because ultimately, I'm getting paid for it. I can make money here. That is something that no other social media platform had ever done. It's incredible. Now, whether TikTok will continue to do that depends on if TikTok has the funds to do that. Now, obviously, TikTok being, friendly with the or friends of the state in China, there is likely to be funds available in the future, right?
Right.
So, is this something that feasibly or realistically Meta or Facebook can do to compete against this?
It's a really interesting point. First of all, absolutely, there's part of their strategy was that angle of, hey, they're the enemy. And I agree with you, not working. Right. So what you're going to do to work. It's interesting because, YouTube, so a Google product, right, has had a version of this with YouTube creators, but not to the effect that TikTok has had. TikTok's had immense success with it.
Right.
Whereas YouTube, it's like a select, it's just been different.
It's super hard to make.
Right. And I think they're taking notice as well. So, not just Facebook, but I think even YouTube is saying, man, we started this first, like, how did you do this? And I think that it is interesting, which is part of the reason why these short form videos have infiltrated Instagram and even Facebook to a degree, just not used near as much. The adoption's just really low.
Yeah.
In comparison. But I think for Facebook, it is really going to be about, the question is, can they? And I don't know.
Yeah.
Like, to be honest, I don't know. I think, it's going to be a tough road for them.
Right.
Where it comes to that. I think where they benefit right now is the fact that they have collected so much data.
Right.
And they have so much of that available.
Right.
So they can continue to get people to advertise.
Right.
But the less relevant they become.
Right. And the higher the pricing.
And the higher the pricing, which is coming. Right. I'm telling you now, it's coming. That's going to be a very interesting, future. So, remains to be seen.
Yeah. Yeah. Fascinating. So if I was trying to create a brand new application for social media, definitely content, right? Content is extremely important. And it what's fascinating is when you look at the content on Instagram or excuse me, on TikTok, it's not always the best content you want to see. Right. It's incredible, but the amount of content that is being generated to produce very basic human desires, right? As an example, OnlyFans, right? OnlyFans has risen in popularity like crazy. Like the amount of revenue it produces is just wild. And most people don't realize that they weren't the first ones to develop in that space, but you had other type of companies that were developed to help pay for creators, right? And fans that you or creators that you liked and you wanted to support, like Patreon,
right?
But this took a totally different, drastic change, right? And so basically, the content that is being generated, what will be the impact for brands, right? Do I want to be associated with this type of content?
Right.
Do I want to be part of this in any way, or what do you think will happen? As will there be a change? What are maybe some of your thoughts?
Yeah, so this is another really interesting one. It's funny because I was thinking, OnlyFans came to mind when you talked about these creators and how like you just have a camera, you're going to be able to get paid. Like you just have a smartphone camera and you're going to get paid, right? And you can have people literally pay for every single thing you do. Like it's quite remarkable. And I think that monetization is a tough one. And it's funny, you bring up Patreon. I think Patreon's a good example where you're supporting an artist and that sort of thing. And this just took it to a whole other level.
Right.
And what's interesting too is the way that has grown so much is by TikTok accounts that say, "Hey, come follow me on OnlyFans." It's like they're using that platform to grow itself, and I think that's a fascinating way to grow is by actually using another platform.
Right.
I think that's really interesting to me. If I were creating some sort of a social media app, and understanding a couple of things. Number one, that first party data is going to be huge,
right,
and that cookieless world is here. Right. Basically here. You have things like, for example, Metapixel, right? And that's a pixel you put on your site. It ties people back to Facebook. Well, that's a third-party cookie, and that's also going away. So, things like that. I would say, so first of all, that short form content is not going away. Yeah. It's just not. It's addictive. You just, see the next thing you want to see, And I will say one thing about TikTok that has made it so successful, aside from some of the things you mentioned, is their algorithm is really strong.
Right.
They have a very solid algorithm that starts serving you up the content they can tell you're consuming. You're watching this entire video and liking it, et cetera. Better than I think Facebook has done and some of these other ones have done. But what I would consider is, number one, collecting as much information as you can, first party. Yeah. Because if somebody's willing to give it and it's first party data, it's yours.
Right.
Like by just opening that app, they've already consented to it. And of course, those policies update, but every time they open that app, number one. Number two, it would be creating avenues for advertisers to spend money, because that first party data is monetizable.
Right.
And so knowing that these groupings, that these topics is another, that's one of the, if you look at Google's privacy sandbox, where kind of where this stuff is going, topics is now their new sort of solution to this cookieless world. Creating content and being really dialed in about how these things are organized becomes very sellable. Yeah. And I think that to me is, you need to be able to monetize not just the usage, because most people are using that app for free.
Right.
But it's those ad dollars. Yeah. And that ad dollars are going to come with, obviously usage. Right. But also that targeting.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. So going back a little bit to the fact of TikTok, right? So one of the main reasons why some of the brands first hesitated advertising TikTok was, this is not my audience, right? Very young people, et cetera, or I don't want to be in that app. But now it's become a necessity, right? To be on that, just because of the fact that there's so many eyeballs in there. But how, do you have the ability to say, you know what, I don't want to be in that type of content, right? Brand safety is important. Right. So, as we just discussed, a lot of this content on TikTok isn't always the most brand safe, right? That's just the fact. It's, you can look at the numbers and it's there, right? So how do we, as brand managers, or how do we combat that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think, there's a few things. Obviously, I can't say it enough about who you're targeting, right? The broader you get, the more you're going to encounter some of that.
Right.
But also there is a level of brand alignment that I think makes some of these really difficult. So, Reddit's another example.
Right.
Where Reddit's got very specific topics that you can just dial it in about who you target on there.
Right.
But if you're not careful, it's a pretty wide open field that shows all sorts of stuff that you may not want to associate with.
Right.
So I think that there's a level at which, the filtering that you do is super important. There are some companies that focus on, the brand safety, especially on things like YouTube. There's going to be literally companies that they specifically focus on, capturing the audio of the video that's on there, capturing transcribing that to see if there's anything objectionable. And so I think it's really just making sure that you're just working with a partner that's dialed into those things, that understands the tactics available, to layer on to some of these social media platforms, and then can execute your ads in a way that feels safe.
Yeah, awesome. All right, Hector. Well, thank you so much for all these topics. I know it's been so much fun talking to you, and I think we're past time here, but it's okay. But again, thank you so much for your time, Hector. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
If you enjoyed this episode and would like to stay updated on future episodes, be sure to subscribe to the Predictive Pulse podcast. Whether you're a data enthusiast, marketer, or business leader, our aim is to provide you with the latest media and analytics trends to help you tap into tomorrow's insights today. Don't forget to follow us on your favorite podcast platform. And if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for future topics, feel free to reach out. We value your feedback and are always eager to hear from our listeners. Thank you again for joining us on this data-driven journey. And until next time, stay ahead of the curve with the Predictive Pulse podcast.